Hi, welcome to Quick Tips on Research Question Hypothesis in Legal Research. There are mainly 2 pointers that you need to remember that would be the crust of the entire lecture. So you're free to go through the 20 minutes or you can put it at into 2 speed and listen to it quickly. Have a great time.
Identified for any research that you want to do. These are the two important components that you must have in your research, right? So you can have or not have your hypothesis, but there's something that you must have is your research questions. All right. So we're just going to quickly go through what is it, what are the checklists that you need to keep in mind, types of research questions and hypothesis. And let me make a disclaimer here when we come to hypothesis particularly. I would definitely be referring to a concept of testing of hypothesis, but that has a lot of statistical element into it. So please excuse me in case we will not be able to go in depth because that would be an entire component in itself. Okay. So we'll start off with the idea of research questions. Now, Prashi rightly laid down to say you would have a lot of questions, the WH questions that has been identified through the process of identifying the research problem, right? You have a lot of questions that as a scholar, you want to answer to. Okay, the formulated or what you say, the structured form of it is what is going to be your research question. It's as simple as that. The answers to the question that a scholar wants to find would be your research questions. Okay. Now, one thing you need to keep in mind, before we go into any of the technicalities, is your research questions must be framed in such a way that the answers would only be obtained post your research. Are you with me? Say, for example, let me give you an example here. Now, let me take an example of, say, let's take an example that is, okay, let's say, for example, the correlation between, let's take the lawyer's life in a law firm, right? So let's look at someone's trying to find out a study on evaluating the mental health of lawyers working in law firms. Okay, so you can probably have a research question like, what is the nature of work engaged by lawyers in a law firm? Now, if you have a question like, what is a law firm? That cannot be categorized as a research question. Got it? So what you need to keep in mind while you frame your research question is that those answers that would be a conclusion but through the research that you conduct. Got it? So as simple as it says is first is the inquiry, fundamental inquiries or guide that the scholar has that would guide you to find the answer, right? The inquiries. They are specific, concise, and particular to the area of research that needs the direction. It is a third most important thing is it is answered or the result is through the evaluation or analysis of researchers' data, information, and contribution. Got it? So let me give you a practical requirement here. Say, for example, let's say for an article, you might have, say, 5 research questions. Of it, 3 must be an answer drawn out from the analysis that you're drawing out in your article. Whereas in your research, in the dissertation or thesis, if you have 7 research questions, let's say 4 of them must only be answered through the analysis or your conclusion towards the end. Got it? So research questions are that's something that you need to keep in mind while framing your research question. And that is why it is tricky about framing research. It's not just about having a WH question. Like, say, for example, it's definitely a question about what is the working time of the law firms? That cannot be a research question. That's definitely an interview question, but that cannot be a research question. Say, what is the nature of a law firm work may not be completely a research question, but now what is what is the challenges causing to the mental health of the legal officers or junior lawyers in the law firm? Or what is the legal measures existing addressing the challenges faced by the law firms in case of such mental health? So some of those are what you can draw out as an answer. Now, how do you identify or how do you come out to developing this research questions? Okay, so that is where it is important to see. First is, of course, your research problem. I don't need to say anything more about it. Prachi has covered it completely to say What is the research problem? What is that problem that you want a solution to? And what is the questions that you would ask to get an answer as a solution to that problem? First one. Second one is the objective of your research. What is that you as a scholar is going to be doing? Right? Okay, you have a problem. It might be about evaluation. So you have a broader picture of something that you have in mind when you identify that problem, right? So what is the objective? What is that you're going to address in that problem? Is it going to be a direct legal issue? Is it going to be a transformation in practice? Is it going to be evaluation? Is it going to be, interestingly, like how Shruti ma'am's project was interesting, especially because it's an exploratory study, because research question becomes a crust of an exploratory study, right? So what is that? What is the nature of research, right? You have identified different types of research. What is that you want to, how do you want to conduct your research? Got it? So second would be your objective. Third would be your nature of research. So is it going to be an exploratory research? Is it going to be an action-oriented research? What is the type of research that you identify yourself with? Got it? Or is it a doctrinal research? Even in doctrinal, what is a particular category of research that you would look into? Got it? So these are the three major factors that would base as a source of your research questions. Okay. Now, how do you frame them? Definitely, it's about first the readings or the literature that you have encountered through the readings. Now, what is important to see here is one of the key areas when you do a research question is that you must not have a document already answering that question for you. Say, when I have a document directly answering my question, it cannot be classified as a research question. Got it? Because the answer is right there. Your research is not going to contribute to that. So when I ask what is the let's say what is the working style of a lawyer, if you have a document directly answering the questions to your question, I mean answering the question, it cannot be categorized as a research question for your research. Got it? So it's equally important that you have your literature done. And now one of the interesting questions that was addressed yesterday was, should we complete the entire literature before we go into framing the literature research question and hypothesis? That is humanly impossible. Now, there is an average amount or socially acceptable level of literature that we will come to, maybe at a later point of discussion. Got it? Now, this is what you need to keep in mind while framing a research question. Got it? First, again, to reinforce, it must not be some question that has an answer directly from the existing literature. Second, it must be a question that can be answered only through your analysis, collection of data, and evaluation. Third, it's based on the sources that you've identified, based on your objective, based on your research problem, based on the type of research that you want to carry out. Right? Now, while framing the research question, there are 5 things that you need to keep in mind. First is, of course, a clarity. You need to be specific. So, for example, now there's always a dispute. Now, I wouldn't say a dispute, a disagreement or a discussion that happens in the academy is about, does the hypothesis come first or the research question comes first? You got it? Because what leads the other? It's like the chicken and egg case, right? So ultimately, your research question can be categorized as a broad. So for the easiest way, what I would generally recommend is, your research question is definitely if you have an hypothesis. That is, if you have an hypothesis, the answer of the questions would be finally testing the hypothesis, right? So you will have it connected. Even if you don't have, what is generally practiced is you have one broad research question followed by 7 sub questions, which would be clear, that is very specific, which would have a visibility of the data that you would be including, that is the variables that we're going to talk about. It should be relevant to the field of study that is drawn from your research problem and objective. It should be specific with reference again to your objective, hypothesis, and your research problem. And most importantly, as Mallikarjun sir rightly pointed out, the measurability. How do you bring in an objectivity to your research? And your research question must also be able to satisfy that measurability involved in it. So can you provide an objectivity to your research through your research questions? Are we okay? You can give me a thumbs up because if in case you find it, or a thumbs down also, so I know that you're following. Yeah. So now I'm not going to be discussing everything in detail because this is something I'll share with you anyways. So your research question, as I said, it would be connected to the type of research that you choose. right? It can be a qualitative research, quantitative research, action-oriented research, doctrinal research, conceptual research, historical research, based on the type. And you would notice that if you're taking, say, a doctrinal research, you would have a combination of your doctrinal research also involved. So you would have a jurisprudential part involved, right? You would have a conceptual question itself involved. Like, for example, Miss Claudia and Miss Varalakshmi ma'am had rightly said about the interest of transgender. Now your research would focus on how is the definition of transgender is. Now law might have a definition for you, but you would say, okay, this particular definition does not satisfy the right or interest that you need to see them in the context of human rights. For that, you would have a conceptual question itself where your foundation is questioned. Yeah. So in that case, you will have a conceptual question trying to see how transgender definition would be. What are the components included? Does a component satisfy the human rights? Let's say the jurisprudential or the theoretical framework of established human rights. Certain things that would question your conceptual clarity. Or it can be a part that questions the historical evolution. Right? Say, for example, let's say someone's taking a research on basic structure. Interestingly, someone had conducted research recently on basic structure in 50 years. So now that is looking at a historical evolution of how the basic structural doctrine has shaped a constitution or its interpretation through judges, right? So it would have a question of a historical relevance, which would say, okay, how has the court, what was the mentality of the court while including a particular concept as a basic structure? So depending on the nature of your research question will have an identification. Got it? Now you have 10 type of research question that's laid out here. Okay, but all of this is important. Why is it important to identify the type of research question? Is because it judge or sets the research in motion. It's as simple as ask the right questions to get the right answer. Most of the time, what happens is you see a disconnect between the introductory chapter and the conclusion chapter and the thread lying through the middle chapters. That's because of the mishap in the research question and how it doesn't connect to the objective or the methodology that you desire to adopt in your research. So it's important that your methodology, the objective problem is reflected into the type of research questions that you have formulated. Got it? And while formulating this, of the lot, some of the techniques that would generally be accepted is first is to identify the keywords. So the parameters or the keywords like Shamsa was referring to comes very important here. Now, as a researcher, you have certain areas that you have identified through all of this. So those keywords are drawn out from your introduction background. It's drawn out through your research problem, objectivity, and of course, through your hypothesis. Now, if you have, say, 10 keywords, at least 5 to 10 keywords, you cannot have, it's preferably not to have more than that. You have your keywords identified that distinguishes your research, right? Based on those keywords used is where you would formulate a research question. Keywords along with the WH questions that you have and what is that you want to conclude or find an answer to would give you a structure of the research questions. Got it? I'll give you an example. So what we have here is, so this is some of the questions that I had for my PhD thesis. How effective is the existing system of legal education in India from perspective of preparing competent and efficient legal professionals? Now, the question of effectiveness, mine was a purely empirical research, which I teaches in ANOVA as a mode of assessment and, the other methodologies. Now, when I say how effective, now I'm presuming or a person reading has the presumption that this is going to involve an empirical element to it. How do you test an effectiveness? It's about the perception that you gather from your stakeholders. So your data is collected to gather how the stakeholders, particularly the students or the alumni, has seen or impacted from the existing education system, how they faced their career compared to the education system. And then I would be answering my question, right? So I want to know the effectiveness of the system. My first would not be a doctrinal method. It would be an empirical study through a perception method, right? So that is where your research question and drafting of it would be important. Now we shall reserve the do it yourself maybe towards the end, because let's say I have another 10 minutes. I need to really go into hypothesis. Are we okay? Yeah? I'm presuming I'm okay. Did I put all of you to sleep? Are you still awake? Yes. Thank you so much. Yes. Now, another important part, right? One of the most important thing that we always, as lawyers, particularly, we are very idealistic, right? We start off our research as revolutionists. We want to change the world, and then we want to make everything under our research be available in our thesis. So we are revolutionaries, trying to make some kind of major. But what happens with research is we need to remember we are ultimately researchers, right? We have our limitations. So what happened with such idealistic research is that you tend to get carried away with your topic. Got it? You tend to, you go on the go of your research, you tend to collect everything that's on the way. So what holds you to your topic is your hypothesis. And as a disclaimer already given, hypothesis one, you don't necessarily need hypothesis in all type of research. For example, in exploratory research, you wouldn't have an hypothesis because you're trying to draw out facts. Got it? You're not testing something. You're not looking at a suggestion or a solution oriented. You're trying to find out a situation that's existing as a preliminary level or a factual research it is. So you may not have an hypothesis included, right? Now, second thing is when you come to testing a hypothesis, there's going to be a lot of statistical information, which I may not be able to share right now. But to make it very simple, hypothesis is nothing but a tentative statement from your reading and identification of research questions and problem that you come down as a conclusion, right? So you have come down to a statement saying, okay, because of so and so, because of particular reason, something has happened. This is the cause of something, right? You are making a conclusion, a tentative conclusion through your preliminary reading, your awareness of the subject, and the questions you try to answer. And this particular preliminary understanding that you have, you're going to put that to test. Interestingly, of course, what happens is people make an attempt to prove their understanding. Inherently, humans are biased. But it can also happen that your initial finding is wrong. So let's say initial finding of transgenders are not included in the society because of their genetical identification or self-identification may be disproved. We may be surprised to see that they are made a part of the system. Right? I'm giving an example. So it's nothing but a tentative statement. Now, how do you come down to this tentative statement? You cannot simply have some random statements that drawn out. A hypothesis, when you frame, what you need to keep in mind is what we call as the variables. As a scholar, let's forget about all the other variables. You need to just keep in mind two important variables. What is the independent variable and the dependent variable? Just keep those in mind. An independent variable is that something that doesn't change, or for time being, you're keeping it as stagnant, right? And a dependent variable. So let's say, for example, increasing, like I want to take Claudia's example, for instance, increasing the literacy or economic literacy of transgenders would increase their lifestyle or inclusivity in the society, right? So what am I doing here? My independent variable is the economic factor, which means as I move it, there is a change that's going to come to another factor. Are you with me? So as far as a legal researcher, if at this point you may by default take, you can decide to choose how you want to go. There are different variables, but for now, at least have that in mind. So you have something that if you alter, that is going to have an effect or an impact on a particular social factor. Got it? So as far as a hypothesis is concerned, when you frame it, that's something that when you make a tentative statement, you cannot say laws are bad and I have understood laws are bad. You cannot have it like that. What happens if the laws are bad? What happens? And you cannot simply say there is ineffective laws. Which part of the law that is ineffective? And because of that ineffectiveness, what is the relation or what is the impact it is leaving? Okay. I want to leave this at there and move forward. Just keep that. Okay, you know how it, importance of it. Of course, objectivity, testability. It focuses your directions. It makes sure you bring in objectivity to your research, and it acts as an anchor. Got it? Now, how do you draw out of it? So an hypothesis is drawn out of the specific research questions, followed by the literatures that you read, followed by the variables that you identify. And how do you identify the variables? Variables are identified again. It's like the vicious circle. Your research questions, keywords. So what is that you have a problem? So ultimately, what is that you have a problem with? What is the problem or an impact that it's leaving, right? So those is what is categorized as a variable. Then the question, is it testable or not? And let me make a disclaimer here. Testability of hypothesis is not just for empirical research, it goes for doctrinal research also. I will make a reference, and there is definitely a way you can bring in objectivity in doctrinal research as well. Then you have to see if testable, and then how well have you defined variables. So how do you bring in a testability? So when I say law is ineffective, how are you going to define the ineffectiveness of law? How are you going to test that? So it is important that you need to define a parameter or say, okay, checklist 1, 2, 3, 4 parameters. This is how I'm going to be testing it. Are we okay? Just try to take the words like variables, 2 variables, correlation, testability. Keep that in mind. If you forget everything else, you can pick it up later on. Now, of course, there are different types of hypothesis. As commonly you know about null hypothesis, alternative, we'll come to it. Before we go into those standard hypotheses, there are different. But something, most commonly used, I'm just going to be referring to the most commonly used one, and which is most feasible for a legal research, right? Most common and the most feasible one, I personally think, would be the cause effect, right? So which simply shares about cause, that is your challenge. The impact is the effect, which is cause is your independent variable, effect is your dependent variable. And how are they connected? And you're trying to test a relationship. And in hypothesis, you use words like significant impact, there leaves impact, or positive effect, negative effect. So you have terminologies that used as connecting words in the hypothesis. Okay. Now, most commonly, most suggestive one is also that if you can establish a cause effect, but it's not necessary that you would find that in all. It can be a statement or otherwise. But as again, disclaimer goes, it's the most commonly or possible, the best one that can be adopted by a legal research. Now it's good that you have a hypothesis, you could have a research question and all that. The most important part, which connects the data analysis Bandari sir was talking about and Prachi was referring to and everything, and ultimately a report comes down to is testing of this hypothesis, which means how are you putting your information to a test? And what distinguishes the hypothesis testing is the scientific method engaged in it. And as far as we're concerned, the most feasible one would be the statistical one. And the moment we hear statistics, it's natural for a lawyer to take a step back. But please remember, statistics is not just about using SPSS or Python and otherwise, but you have so many other tools that's come forward, including a simple Excel sheet, right? So you can use those. It's only about bringing a objectivity to your testing. Right? It's about putting the data that can be collected through doctrinal research method or empirical research method into a, let's say, what is say as numerical formats, then putting it into the parameters, seeing how the correlation goes. So you have different formulas that's used and test methods that's used. So for which you typically use 2 types of hypothesis, which is a null hypothesis and alternative hypothesis. Now, just in simple words, null hypothesis simply is a presumption that there's absolutely no relationship between the variables. As simple as that. You're simply saying there is no correlation between the ineffectiveness, let's say, financial literacy of transgenders with their social status. Simple as that. Now, when you come to an alternative hypothesis, you're trying to make a statement saying financial literacy of a transgender directly impacts their quality of life, thereby impacting their thereby impacting their social status. Do you get that correlation? So one, you don't have a relation at all. Then you're establishing a relation. For that, you have to collect certain information. Now, how do I know about financial literacy? Poor scholars have made it, gone through the struggle to find out. So it can be a qualitative research. Fortunately, the survey has it. You take that information, or it can be an interview with them. It can be a questionnaire, however. Now you look at, then you look collect information about the quality of their life. What is the profession? Where do they stay? All those details. Then they look at
Yeah,
how they live. I will, yes,
yeah.
sir.
Please try to conclude.
I
Yeah.
will conclude in another 2 minutes because my timer went on. Yeah. So you understood this part of it, right? Now you have, I will share this with you. You have these tests that you include, which is I've put in as simple as I can in the explanations. Don't worry about p-value and stuff like that right now. I just wanted to make it look like, it's a big deal, but it is there. So you have different hypothesis testing methods. You have t-test, ANOVA. So what is the beauty about it all is you have a tool like SPSS, or again, as Prashi said, Python, which can definitely be easily learned. And you have a lot of mechanism that can be drawn out. So the only thing I want to emphasize right now here is you can include the scientific methodology into your doctrinal research also. And one of the example I want to take from series is how she's coded her research participants. So this is the same methodology. You can identify the parameters. Thematic analysis is one of the best way to do an hypothesis testing in doctrinal research. Case law analysis, which is case law mapping. When you identify these parameters, is one of the best ways to do doctrinal hypothesis testing. I've given the procedure here for you to refer to at a later point. In short, I want to conclude saying you can bring in a level of objectivity no matter what methodology of research you've adopted. It's only about identifying the right questions, right objectivity and problem, drawing out the 5 to 10 keywords.
Hey, I hope you had a great time through finding out what research question hypothesis is in legal research. And let's stay connected. And at any point you feel stuck with your research, do not hesitate to reach out. All the best and have a great time. And of course, do not forget to like, share, and subscribe. Of course, I won't be spamming you with videos. But hey, who knows? As soon as I put up a video, you will be the first to know.